Hello, friends. Welcome to The Way Home, Crossnore Communities for Children's Facebook Live show and our podcast. My name is Holly Kessler, and I'm the Senior Director of Community Relations at Crossnore. Every Tuesday afternoon, we spend some time talking with a few of our staff members or perhaps a community partner about the work that we do at Crossnore, the child welfare system overall, trauma-informed care, ways that we're engaging in our community, all kinds of topics. If you miss our live show, you can always rewatch on Facebook or catch the show on our YouTube channel. The podcast comes out on Fridays on our blog, which you can see at crossnore.org. So there are plenty of ways to watch our show each week and engage with us. Today, my guest is Beatriz Vides. Beatriz is the Senior Director of Program Development at Crossnore's Center for Trauma Resilient Communities. So help me welcome Bea to the show today. Hello, friend.
Hi, Holly. Good to see you.
It is good to see you as always. Always good to see you. I'm glad that you're here with me today. Why don't you start by telling everybody a little bit about yourself? Tell us about your role at the center. And, anything else you want to tell us so we can get to know you.
Sure. About 6 or 7 years ago, I actually came to work at Crossnore as a consultant as the Winston-Salem campus was really embarking on their trauma resilient work. And I was very fortunate to meet Brett Loftus, our CEO, and also who is also one of the co-founders of the Center for Trauma Resilient Communities, or CTRC. And I had already been working with the other co-founder, David McCorkle. And so David had been working with Crossnore for about 12 years and asked me to come and work with the Winston-Salem campus back then. And it was, it's just an incredible moment in time for me to meet these incredible individuals doing incredible work in North Carolina. And out of that connection comes this idea of continuing to do trauma resilient work together as a center that Crossnore will house. And now we have become this incredible program that does trauma resilient building across the country and across the world, really, at this point. And that's what I've been up to with the center. Prior to that, I've been working with building trauma resilient organizations since probably 2005.
Wow.
So I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me. It's just such an honor to be in this conversation with you and feel really proud to be part of Crossnore and being one of the programs that Crossnore sponsors and helps the work.
Well, we love you, Bea, and we love the work that you do and all of I've been in many trainings that you have led, and you are just terrific. So we're super glad that you came to us first as a consultant and now are actually as a co-founder, also on staff with the center. So we're super excited that you're part of our Crossnore family. So tell us, I'll just ask you a personal question. Where are you from? And when did you come to the United States? Because I think that has a bearing on what we're going to talk about today in terms of trauma that happens in immigrant communities and maybe some trauma-informed care around that.
Yeah, so I am originally from El Salvador in Central America, and I came to the United States in 1982. I still remember it's December 9th, 1982. And it was a long journey for my family to talk about my immigration stories, talk about my family's immigration story.
Right.
So my father left El Salvador due to a civil war in the 1970s. And 8 years later, it took about 8 years for all of us to migrate all the way to New York City, believe it or not. And so, it was like many immigrants. We were really trying to look for refuge and sanctuary in another country where we didn't have to deal with a civil war and the impact of a civil war. Mm-hmm. And so I was born and raised and was there until about 16. And then I arrived in New York City in 1982 in the middle of the winter, not knowing one word of English, and being absolutely lost in terms of like, where am I and what am I doing here?
Wow. What was that experience like? I just can't even imagine landing here. And of course, you're with your family, so I'm sure that was a comfort to you, but not speaking any English and in a city like New York, I just can't imagine.
Well, it's an interesting time, and I often reflect on that. I want to say that I don't reflect the entire experience of an immigrant community,
Sure.
but I do share a lot of experiences that other immigrants experience, right? So I was fortunate enough to arrive in this country legally. I was one of the few people in my family that was able to do that because I was the youngest of 6 children.
Oh, wow.
And so by the time I arrived, it was literally one day to the next, I was in New York. And so what was really challenging about it is I remember arriving at this city where you felt supposedly we're going to feel safer, right? Because we are escaping a war that's really bloody and really traumatic.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and then I get to New York and I immediately started feeling kind of depressed. And the reason for that is because I went and lived in these massive high rises and nobody knew each other. It was in the middle of winter. And what I found fascinating and very quickly I figured out that there was no real community.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I had left a country that was bloody and violent, but then the community was really strong.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so now I'm in a new country and I'm safe in my body, right? But I'm not necessarily feeling emotionally safe. I definitely have lost my community. I didn't speak English. And so it took an incredible amount of time and patience to adapt. I remember so that was in December. In January, I had to start high school. And my parents are immigrants. They don't speak English. They're not going to give me an orientation of what high school is going to be like. And all of a sudden, I'm in this building where everybody speaks English. I speak zero. And I'm having to figure out by visual cues where I'm supposed to be, how everything is ran.
Wow.
And honestly, I don't even remember having anyone orient me. It's like, bam, there it is. So from day one to, and within a week, I'm inside of a culture that I don't understand anything they're saying. They're not understanding what I'm saying. And I'm literally relying in my visual cues to figure out how to manage it. On the other hand, I also felt very excited. I mean, just the fact that I was in the middle of the world, right? Like New York City.
Right. It's an amazing place.
I mean, truly, you're going to land somewhere, that's where it is. So every day, I just remember that if you ever want to go to New York, I'm your girl. Because I have walked that city from the top to the bottom, literally up north, downtown to east and west, and every little street of that city. Wow. That first year that I was here, I made it my mission to know every single street in New York.
Wow.
Because there was nothing else to do anyway. So there were some challenges, and the biggest, I think, it had to do with language and it had to do with community.
Mm-hmm.
We also did not land. There's a strong Salvadorian community in Long Island, and we did not live nearby. So we were really in another, city, and it was really, really, really challenging. But I do come from a lineage of incredibly resilient people. Which is part of our story.
Yeah, I can tell just by talking with you.
We were going to make it.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Just so many things that you said just struck me. First of all, I hope that, now that we're doing better now with immigrant children than we did back then, for kids that come into school and aren't speaking English yet and that kind of thing. So hopefully we've learned some things, since 1982. But I'm also struck by, you had some trauma around your own home country and what was going on there. And then you come into the United States, and there has to be some trauma involved in that, and going to a place where you don't know anybody. And like you said, you lost your community and no one could communicate with you. Is that typical in immigrant I can't speak today, populations, or are there other ways that trauma also shows up for immigrants as they come into the U.S.?
As you were talking about it, I think that sometimes folks there's this image that you have, right? That if you leave your country and you migrate to another country that is providing you with some safety, you leave the trauma behind. And I think that was my assumption for a long time until I started actually learning about what trauma is. In what I found out is that you leave the situation geographically,
Right.
but it's almost like the situation comes with you internally. And so it's a complex issue. And again, I want to make sure that I repeat again that I don't represent every experience of every immigrant here. And I also will say that different cultures experience different kinds of traumas, but in general, I think what happens is you come out of a survival situation, right? Like a traumatic situation in your country. And then you walk away and you're like, have this like almost hierarchy of needs. And the first one is like, okay, I'm safe in my body. But then you realize, and what I know now about trauma is that the situation that happened to you, all the pain that you experienced, and all of the images that you saw, all that you were exposed to, that comes with you. And so what happens with that, it really creates it for those of you who are watching who might be working with immigrant children, is that then you are now compounded and really faced with having to figure out what are the complexities of trauma that you are addressing. Right? Because then you have the trauma of leaving your country. You have the trauma, sometimes I think for a lot of populations now, maybe the experience in the United States might be better, but the travel, for example, in Central America, they call the journey from your home to the United States, they call it the path of death.
Wow.
Because what can happen to you in that process of arriving at the United States, right? It's people can lose their lives. Women can experience sexual assault. I mean, all sorts of trauma. So you now are bringing the trauma of your home country that you experience. You now experience the departure of leaving your community behind. There are many fathers who leave children behind, many mothers who leave children behind, many children who leave parents behind. So now you have that trauma of the separation. Then you add the trauma of the journey.
Right.
And then you add the trauma of the immigrant experience here, particularly. And again, I think, I'm not here to talk about the politics or what is right or wrong about the immigration statuses and anything like that. We're here to talk about the trauma experience. So once you're here, depending on your experience, you can experience a lot of atrocities related to being an illegal immigrant in the United States. And so you now have what we call complex trauma.
Right.
And so which one do you address first? And for people who are working with children, here's another layer. If you have a family that is illegal in the country, right, or doesn't have legal status, at any time, anybody in that family can be deported. And so now you are living daily this sort of agony of like the possibility of another trauma.
Right.
A possibility that is very real. And so another separation. So I think that the way I wanted to delineate first, like the complexity of layers of pain, loss, and trauma that you are addressing related to the immigrant experience.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that because all trauma is difficult, but once you've layered trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma, it, like you said, it becomes that complex trauma that then where do you start in helping somebody to heal when there's that many layers?
And we haven't even talked about the trauma that happens in your own family, right? Because that we've actually just addressed the geography, the country, the community, the trajectory to get here, the actual experience here. And now if you add to that you have a family that has dysfunction, or do you have a family that has intergenerational poverty, or you have a family that has intergenerational trauma, like in my case, my parents, right? My parents grew up with a lot of poverty. with a war, very
Mm-hmm.
little education, and their parenting was survival parenting.
Yes.
So they passed that along to me. And then in my household, in addition to all the immigration issues we also had, alcohol in the family or
Mm-hmm.
domestic violence in the family. And so the complexity of the trauma is pretty profound. And you're right, that makes it really challenging. Which one do you address first?
Yeah.
How do you prioritize that? So it's
Wow.
complex.
Well, and I wonder too, are there things, again, we're not here to talk about the political side of things, but, when an immigrant family comes into our communities, are there things that we do maybe inadvertently that sort of add to that trauma?
Mm-hmm. I think some communities do better than others in engaging. Like, interestingly enough, as part of this center, right, I work all over the country and all over the world, really. I mean, we've had clients in Chile, South Africa, Nepal, Mexico. I know that David has worked in Scotland and Ireland, and so we have the luxury and the really a lot of privilege in seeing a lot of communities. And so what I do know is that the communities that do better integration work, you will see agencies, and I think this is it is through organizations that the better work is done. Mm-hmm. So just to give you an example, so like I'm working with Louisville, Kentucky, and we've had a contract there for about 4 years. We're entering our 5th year. We work with a community there called Americana, and so their entire work is related to refugees that are coming in, especially over the last 5 years, where you're having refugees who have been in refugee camps for a long time. They have a program, for example, that they've created related to addressing sexual violence, for example, or working with immigrant populations who have been tortured. And so it is through this organizational work that a lot of Latinx or immigrant community, in particular, those who come from very traumatized situations like war, etc., it is through the organizations in the communities that do get a lot of help and support. So that's one very direct way, is to actually have services for folks who actually need that support. The other way, I think, in which it happens is through faith communities. I think that I cannot emphasize enough that faith communities here have been very embracing from the very beginning of the immigrant experiences. For example, I can tell you one of my best friends around my age who also flew El Salvador through a war. She literally went from church to church to church to church to church from El Salvador all the way to Washington State. Wow. And it is, and the faith community has traditionally really stepped up to take care of a lot of needs related to just basically supporting immigrant communities. And I think that the other part is good neighbors.
Yeah.
I think there is nothing, I can't tell you how important it is to have good neighbors around you. I do know, for example, that just to give you an example, my mom, for example, doesn't speak English after so many, many years. That's not her forte, right? Language. She speaks the basics. Right. And she lives in a primarily English-speaking neighborhood in upstate New York. And so we're always kind of worried, like, how is she going to manage? However, she has neighbors on both sides who don't speak one word of English, of Spanish. And somehow they have welcomed my mom through plants. My mom welcomes them through food, and you have this beautiful experience of good neighborhoods because you're a good neighbor. That is, again, I think that there's the way that sometimes this trauma piece manifests is in the traumatic experience for communities, immigrant communities. Sometimes it's isolation, not finding resources. not knowing what resources are. So one of the things that we were doing, for example, in Louisville, Kentucky, is trying to figure out how to, first of all, how to make a list of all the resources available, because there are some available.
Yeah.
Secondly, is how do we make that available in different languages? And so, so there's a lot of things that can be done in that respect. And I also want to highlight that in some parts of the country, immigrants have a tough time.
Yeah.
Because we also deal with, racism. We also deal with a lot of microaggressions related to our immigration status, whether you are legal or not. There's sometimes a lot of assumptions about that. But I think community organizations, faith communities, good neighbors, right? Those are all places in which we can be protective and supportive of the immigrant culture.
Yeah, I like those suggestions. I know that my church here in Winston has actually what we call good neighbor teams that are working with some Afghan immigrants right now, and it seems to be making a big difference for those folks and helping to build at least a small amount of community around them. So I just wondered if there is anything else that you've talked some about around organizations, and certainly, organizations that want to know more about trauma-informed care, whether they're working with immigrant populations or other populations, can contact the center to learn more. But what about for individuals? Are there any things that you would say to us just as people, as we live our lives and are meeting people in communities? Sounds like your puppy in the background. How can we do a better job of welcoming newcomers to our communities, regardless of where they're from?
Yeah. So, at the center, we spend some time talking about cultural humility. And the difference between, and we talk about cultural competence, which is really good, and the differences between cultural competence and cultural humility. You can just hold on for 1 second. And so I think that's a practice that's really important for all of us. So cultural competence is really about learning about people. Right? So like, for example, if you're my friend and I know that you work, one of your colleagues is Salvadorian, right? So cultural competence is you become a little savvy about what do Salvadorians eat? Let me check the country. How many people, what language do they speak, right? What is their culture like? And so you gather some data about Salvadorians. And so that's the competence piece. The cultural humility piece is that even though you know that there's certain features that are common in Salvadorians, when you meet me, you don't assume that those are part of my life.
Right.
The cultural humility comes in like being curious, being curious about the other. Right. Yeah. So then we get to know more of our individual differences. And that's the same for me with you, right? Like if I want to get to know you, I'm not going to assume, oh, Holly, just a white woman. I'm not going to assume that, right? I'm going to be curious. Where are you from? Is it there a difference if you're from North Carolina versus you're from upstate New York? I want to know what are some of the distinctions that make you who you are. So I think that curiosity about learning about other people will be really good. I always also tell people in that cultural humility piece is what do we need to do, right? We eat our food, listen to our music, and try to speak our language. And that it really exposes you to a very different lens.
Yeah.
And so I think that open up and be curious. You will be surprised how similar we are.
Yes. Yes. I think that's true. Yeah.
It's really funny. And I just tell you this story. Like for some reason in the United States, I lived in a lot of rural areas. And I think I like quiet. I like mountains. And so in rural areas, right, like I'll find, like I used to live in this town called Saugerties, New York. And my neighbor there, it's been across the street, has been like maybe 3 or 4 generations from that town named Saugerties. So I moved in and I'm an immigrant, right? And Barry, and rest in peace, became one of my best friends. Everything about the two of us will assume that we are so different and we wouldn't get along.
Right.
And so he's a man, he's a white man, he's from the country, he's very traditional. He'd never left the town. He's never left the town more than 10-mile radius, right? A steak and potatoes kind of guy. And so one day we sat outside and he was curious and he came over and we struck this friendship. And before you know it, I was going over there to help him. He was coming over to help me. And we forged this friendship that was so powerful. And I remember one time he says to me, I said, I never understood this. I mean, I cook beans and you cook beans, and I just can't believe how different the flavors are. That's awesome. And so I tell that story only in that I think that if from the outside, Barry and I would have never been friends.
Yeah.
If you go by the shell, right, or by experience, or like, well, he's from Saugerties, he's, somebody would call him a name, or they would call me a name. But when we met at that human level, we realized that we want the same things.
Yeah.
We actually found we had very similar values. I find myself having a lot of common ground with like folks in different classes, for example, because I understand the class struggle, right? And so it's interesting how much we find in common. And when we start looking for that commonality, something happens that's magical, Holly.
Yeah.
And so I will say, if you have a neighbor, if you have someone that you've been curious about, don't be afraid, reach out. You'll be surprised how much you have in common.
Yeah. And people like to talk about themselves. They like to talk about where they're from and their family and their traditions. And so you're not, I think you're not bothering anybody by asking questions and getting to know them. I appreciated your story about Barry and what a tremendous friendship that must have been. And that I think is just a great place for us to end. It's amazing how quickly time goes, but I so appreciate, Beatriz, your sharing your story with us and giving us some insight to what it is like to be an immigrant. And then your practical suggestions around how we can maybe make that journey a little bit easier for folks that we meet. We've barely scratched the surface, so we'll have to have you back and talk about this subject maybe from a different perspective. But thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Holly.
Yeah, it was great to have you. So, folks, as I've thanked our guests for today, let me also say thanks to each of you who are watching or listening. We appreciate the opportunity to tell you about Crossnore and about the Center for Trauma Resilient Communities. For more information, please visit our website at crossnore.org or follow us on social media at Facebook, Instagram, or LinkedIn. That's all for today, but I hope you will join us again next week right here on The Way Home.